de Salud Pública propende por hacer estos seminarios en un idioma extranjero. En el día de hoy la actividad va a ser en inglés y tenemos como invitada a la magíster Themrise Khan de Pakistán. Themrise es una investigadora independiente y profesional con más de 25 años de experiencia trabajando en diferentes organizaciones internacionales, en organizaciones de ayuda, en organizaciones para promover la equidad de género y trabaja en temas de migración global. Ella pues ha trabajado con diferentes agencias multilaterales, ONGs, y ha trabajado en Pakistán, en Canadá y en el sur de Asia. También ha participado en múltiples publicaciones científicas y recientemente publicó el libro White Sovereigns in International Development Theories, Practice and Lived Experience, de Daraya Press de Canadá del 2023. Ella también tiene un blog en donde participa activamente y vive en Canadá. Ella tiene un máster en Development Management del London School of Economic and Political Science y tiene un Bachelor en Environmental Studies de la Universidad de York en Toronto, Canadá. Entonces, le doy esta bienvenida en español y ahora sí paso a inglés. Welcome to Master Themrise Khan. We would like to thank her to be here with us in this international activity, and she is going to present her paper, How We Classify Countries and People and Why It Matters. Welcome, Themrise. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hola, ¿cómo estás? That's about the extent of my Spanish for now, so forgive me for not knowing your beautiful language. Thank you, Andres, for inviting me today to speak about the article that I wrote with some of my other colleagues. And one of the reasons we wanted to write this article is because we were not happy with the way the terminology in global health and global development described people around the world. We felt that there was a lot of divisions in the language that was being used, and the language is English, of course. So it started off with how we currently describe the world in terms of its development capacity. So we define part of the world as the global north and part of the world as the global south. And this is just one of the terminologies that has been coming down for decades since global health and global development became very large and major disciplines of work and study. It started off with terminologies such as the first world and the third world, which were used very frequently to describe countries that were rich and countries that were poor. And this terminology was introduced after the Second World War, where first world were countries, the rich white countries of the West, and the third world were the poor non-white countries of the rest of the world. And this was a very derogatory term because it missed the second world entirely, which was terminology used for perhaps countries in transition from the third world to the first world. But in the development studies discipline, I recall studying these terms and actually using these terms myself. So I am from Pakistan. Pakistan is part or was part of the third world. And I studied in Canada. Canada was part of the first world. Likewise, almost all countries of Latin America, South America, and the Caribbean were part of the third world, whereas the United States was part of the first world. This is just to give some context. Over time, these terms continued to change. We moved then from the first world and the third world into developed and developing countries. So those countries that were first world were now developed countries. Again, USA, Canada, Europe, UK, Australia, whereas all other countries of the world were developing. So there was a very strong distinction in this, that developed meant that these countries had reached the height of their progress. And all the other countries of the world were nowhere near it. They were in process of developing. These terms eventually also started to change with the introduction of the World Bank getting involved in this. And they moved to terms like HDC, so higher developed countries, and lesser developed countries, LMIC, lower middle income countries, and LIC, lesser income countries. So then income became a indicator to divide countries into different categories. And the World Bank terms still remain. But developed and developing countries, or more developed or lesser developed countries, eventually changed into what we now use, the terms global north and global south. So the interesting thing about north versus south is that the world was literally divided in half. If you look at the globe, it was divided in half, where the upper half, which was the north, happened to be countries geographically like Russia, Europe, the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States. And by virtue of them being rich colonial powers, former colonial powers, they were defined as global south. And everything under them, so that was Latin America, Africa, Asia, was the global south. Ironically, Australia and New Zealand were part of the global north, despite being geographically under the global south. So if you read our article, we've shown a diagram in which we've shown the line being drawn right across, but then going down, circling Australia and New Zealand and coming back up. So it's not exactly a straight line. And again, the definitions for these countries were based on their wealth, their economic wealth, their political power, their military might, and their language, their religion, and very much so their color. So these were all white countries, as opposed to the rest of the world being non-white countries. So race was a very, very important distinction in dividing the country into two halves. This is where we stand now. We still look at, we still use the words, the terms global north for the rich, formerly colonial countries of the world, former colonizers of the world. And all the other countries, non-white countries that were colonized by the countries of the global north, we refer to them as countries of the global south. Now, problematic as it is that the world is now defined based on wealth, race, and income, is the fact that many countries that actually technically fall under the definition of the global south are actually now very rich and powerful countries. So you have Saudi Arabia, you have the United Arab Emirates, you have Turkey. These are now countries that are very powerful politically and economically, yet they fall in the definition of the global south. So that doesn't make sense. The only distinction that one can make there is a difference of race, that these are non-white countries. That's why they are in the global south. So where are we then? And what does this show us, particularly in the field of global health and global development? So In global health, as we've seen during COVID, for instance, during vaccine distribution and vaccine use, you obviously know that there was a lot of discrepancy between which countries had easy access to vaccines and which countries didn't. So countries of the global north had ready access to vaccine, whereas countries of the global north did not have access to vaccines. And again, that distinction came into play very obviously. But why? Again, wealth, income, and color. So that's a very strong indicator of the fact that the terminology that we use to classify countries is not just terminology in terms of the origins, perhaps, of those countries, the social and economic origins, is the fact that we think that those countries are lesser deserving as well. So the terminologies that's been used, North, developed, advanced, high-income countries, or rich, are much better than those countries of the South, less developed, less advanced, developing, LIC, low-income countries, and poor category. So we've made a very clear distinction that some countries are deserving and some countries are not. This is why classifying countries is problematic. And this is why we feel that the terminology is being used to divide the world into two parts, one part that is deserving and one part that is not deserving, is obviously a very, very problematic concept. It alludes to an unevenness. So things are not equal. There is no equality when we use these terminologies. I no longer use the terms global south and global north. I use them as so-called global north and so-called global south. Because the issue here is who decided on these terms? Who decided that the world should be divided into two separate parts, one a good and a rich part, and one a not so good and a poor part? It was ironically the white Western governments with more power that have come up with all these definitions. Right from the terms third world and first world to north versus south, it has been the West that has been coming up with these terminologies. Whether it is the World Bank, or whether it is international bilateral donors, whether it is simply just the United States, for instance, who has the most power globally, it is a one-sided definition and categorization. It also points how colonialism has influenced the way the world works today. So it is the former colonial powers deciding, even today, after the end of colonialism, how the world is to be categorized. And the distinctions made are also because of the flow of funds that go from one part of the world to the other part of the world. But it is heavily, heavily influenced by colonialism and by racism. So what do we do about it? How do we change this? How do we make it more inclusive? So we have about 6 recommendations that we gave in our article. The first recommendation is that we could recognize the unique geographical distinctions that define the world. So for instance, you have the continent of Africa. Africa itself is made up of 5 distinct regions. Asia is divided both culturally into the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. So it's not just one continent. Latin America is comprised of Central and South America. Then you have the Caribbean islands, and then the Pacific islands on the other side. All these countries and regions hold their own geographical identities. So why we keep saying that the global South is not a homogeneous term. The global South is not just one entity. It is many different countries, languages, cultures, histories, races. So why are we lumping them all into one big category? So we suggest that each of these regions should be recognized for their own identity. Second, there has been a suggestion in some articles that we also reference in our article to use the term walled world, W-A-L-L-E-D, walled, as in a wall world. So this shows how 14% of the world's population hides behind a fortress or a world which denies entry to the rest of the world based on wealth. So this is very clear when it comes to visa policies, for instance. Many countries of the West deny Africans and Latin Americans visas into their country. So this is only 14%, 14% of the world that decides whether or not the remaining 76% should be allowed into their country. We also have physical walls that have come up. You know, there is during Trump's border wall between Mexico and the USA, Latin America's movements to North America is very restricted. And we have other examples of Fortress Europe now, for instance, Europe not letting in refugees. So there is a suggestion, let's call it a walled world, those countries that actually restrict entry into their countries to the rest of the world. The third recommendation we give is, instead of automatically equating low resource settings to low and medium income countries, we could be more specific about why and how a setting is low resource. For example, is a country a low resource financially? Or is it a low resource country because it doesn't have adequate infrastructure or human resources? Why are we calling it a low income country? How are we defining income? What is a medium income country? Again, who came up with these definitions? So if we want to define countries by income, we must be very clear how we are defining income. Fourth, we can clearly discourage some terms, and some terms are discouraged. For instance, first world versus third world and developed versus developing are very, very racist in their approach. Using income might be a better example, like we said in the previous recommendation, because it is a little more useful in providing insights behind the economic and social variables that define a country. So for example, we have quoted Rosling's categorization of 4 income levels, which is a little more nuanced. It has more detail in it, rather than just saying countries are rich or countries are poor. Then terms such as BIPOC, if you have heard, Black, Indigenous, people of color, clearly denote that there is Black, there is Indigenous, and then there are people of color. This is seen as as these races or these categories not having distinct origins. And it suggests that white people are without color. Why are white people not people of color? So it may be more appropriate to refer to people by their ancestry. For example, Northern Europeans or West Asians, West Africans, or Middle Eastern, etc., or by their individual countries itself. So instead of talking about Arabs, let's talk about Emiratis, or let's talk about the Saudis, or let's talk about the Libyans, etc., etc. And finally, in the development context, there has been much said about the use of terms such as aid givers and aid receivers, donors and beneficiaries. So this is my world now, the world of development. But this requires the entire aid industry to reflect on its own role in the world. Simply replacing these terms is not enough, and it will not change our ways. So we end with these recommendations, but the crux of our article is that the terminology that divides the world is problematic. It is a very Eurocentric and Western-centric way of looking at the world, and it completely bypasses the issue of racism, colonialism, and also the idea that each country has its own distinct geographical identity. You can't even lump Africa into one. It is a continent, but there are 56 countries in Africa. So each country has its own distinct history, its own distinct language and culture. So you need to further break that down. So calling countries global north or global south, developed and developing are very, very demeaning ways of looking at the world and where it stands today. So with that, we just wanted to put out some food for thought and consideration about how, when we talk about countries of the world, exactly what is it that we are trying to say, and how should we be saying it instead? Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you very much to Themrise. I have some questions about her article. Let me see here. Okay, and of course you can ask other questions if you want. Okay, I will start. The classifications in table 1 are almost all dichotomies. What's the main approach? What was the main approach for two groups in the past? And do you suggest other classifications going beyond the dichotomies?
Sorry, can you just repeat the first part of the question?
Oh, the table 1, in the classifications in table 1, we have only dichotomies with the exception of Rosling for levels, but the rest are dichotomies. Why do you think the previous approach was dichotomize everything in all the regions or all the countries? And do you have new suggestions for working in global health?
The dichotomy is the issue here. Because like we've said, there is more than just black and white, right? And that's why we found Rosling's classification of countries to actually be useful, because it pulled out a lot of nuances. And so as we were going through the list, we developed this table, the four of us, based on our own knowledge and based on what was out in the literature. And yes, everything in the literature was dichotomous. Right? That is the whole point of these terminologies. And their origins make it very clear that those who came up with these terms were very clear that there is us, and then there is the rest of the world. So it's the dichotomy that we were addressing, and it's the dichotomy that needs to be done away with. We cannot look at the world in two parts only. The world is made up of 109 or 110 parts, however many countries there are in the world today. And so we need to come out of this dichotomous use of terminologies, and we need to be much more specific, which is why we feel that we must look at regions, we must look at individual countries as well, to be able to refer to each other equally and respectfully.
Okay, thank you. Other point very interesting in your article is the origins of concepts first and third world based on Marxist theories. Could you explain us more details? Because it was very interesting to see
Okay.
things.
So I am not the academic in this group who wrote it. This was more written by academics, but this was it was post-World War II that began the development industry. And it was post-World War II where the first application of division of income and wealth and status was actually put into place. Our the entire global development ecosystem was a post-World War II system. So in 1952, Marxist theory was still very, very much alive in most of Europe and North America. And it was Marxist theory based on the fact that some countries are richer and better off than other countries that was behind the classification of the first and the third world. But what we didn't realize at that point, because the first and third world was used for many, many decades. In fact, some people still use those terms, and we have to correct them and say that first world and third world is no longer in use. In the late 2000s, after we moved finally into global south and global north, people, economists, sociologists, anthropologists stopped using the terms first world and third world because it was based on a very racist implication that third world is really right down the line. So it is literally 1, 2, and 3. And the fact that second world was equally not used, and there was an intentional gap between the two, first and third world, also shows that the first world was much, much higher economically, socially, and politically than the rest of the world. So eventually, a lot of sociologists realize that these terms are not only inaccurate, they are also very derogatory and racist. And so the terminology was not used anymore. And anyone who still uses it in their writings has to be corrected. And you'd be surprised, people are still academics, researchers, many of them from the global north, from the rich white countries, are still using the words third world to refer to us in Latin America, South Asia, Africa. So it just goes to show that even in the minds of many academics and researchers and policymakers, we are still far, far below, and they are still much better than everybody else.
Okay, thank you. What do you think about new colonial powers, for example, the role of China?
I don't really want to say much about China, because this is a question I get asked. We all get asked a number of times. I mean, China, I think, is a completely different discussion altogether. China is technically global south, but it's obviously not at all. And I think China and even other countries like Russia, for instance, are completely a different ballgame altogether. In the aid industry, China is taking over through its infrastructure development in many countries. People do see it as a neo-colonial. There is, its global influence can't be denied. But I think bringing China into the mix is all about geopolitics, and it is all about North America trying to retain its global power, which is now fast decreasing. But there's more than just China. There's India, there's Russia, there is now Turkey, there is Saudi Arabia. So I think it's not just about China, it's about many countries who are now trying to become the new global leaders after the United States. And the United States still very, very much trying to be the leader of the world. So that's all I would like to say about China, but I think that's a completely different discussion. You can't really respond to that in a, as a quick answer.
Okay, thank you. The Latin American scholars are not actively participating in these global health discussions. How can we improve our participation from Latin America?
Very good question. I think that's something countries of Latin America need to come together and discuss themselves. There is a huge push towards regionalization. So for instance, Africa as a region itself, Latin America as a region itself. And as you know better than me, Latin America is also not homogeneous. You've got a number of countries, all with different histories, similar but different histories and geographies and ideas. But Latin America as a collective needs to come together and push back against the rest of the world, against particularly the countries of the so-called global south. So there needs to be regional cohesion. We don't see that in many regions of the world. You don't see regional cohesion, for instance, in South Asia, where I am. All our countries are fighting with each other. You see the same in Africa, and some countries in Latin America are more powerful, like Brazil, for instance, are much more powerful and globally connected than other countries like Venezuela. So there needs to be a regional collective. I think all over the world, not just in Latin America, but in Africa and Asia, that can have its own voice on the global stage, and that can say, this is our share of the global resources, and this is our contribution to it in terms of innovation, technology, health methodologies, and we deserve our share globally. This is not for somebody to take away from us. It is for us to develop ourselves. But I just feel regions themselves need to be stronger and come together and work collectively to be able to do that.
Okay, thank you. And now we can have questions from the other participants. In this part in Spanish. Pueden preguntar en español y yo traduzco pues la pregunta, pero entonces pueden hacer preguntas ya sea en español o en inglés. Gracias. Sí, ¿alguien quiere preguntar? ¿Alguien más, por favor? Okay, we don't have other questions, but I have a contribution, and I will share here the webpage of Gapminder. Gapminder is the foundation of Rosling. What's his name? Hans, as I remember. You know, Themrise, I am alumni of Rosling.
Oh, okay. No, that's why.
In Karolinska Institute, and that's why I know the Gapminder methodology. I have that. Okay.
You know more than
unfortunately, Professor Rosling has but I received classes from him. And here is Gapminder webpage. And we have some questions in English or Spanish. Please, Adriana.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to try to make my question in English. I want to know, Doctor, what is the role of the academy? Try to support this kind of way to look the countries. What is our role when we write or when we do research? What is our role to stop the way we saw the countries or the regions?
Thank you, Adriana. I think that is very important because a lot of these terms are very, very common in academia and in academic research. And I think that's one of the places where you could actually yourself sit down and see whether this classification is useful or not. And in what terms, because academia is also very broad, right? We're talking about several disciplines: economics, sociology, anthropology, health, development. These terminologies are used across all these disciplines, but they mean very different things in each discipline. So in economics, for instance, global north, global south is used to define wealth and status and economic status of countries. In the study for global development, it is used to actually see which countries have more poverty than others, for instance. In anthropology, it's seen as where the origins of different races came from. But I think the research is exactly where you can make the start for change. So instead of referring to regions in your research, I think it's important to actually speak about the countries at hand and not go into the issue of classification. So if you're doing research on, let's say, I don't know, Chile versus Argentina, it doesn't have to be, you're not looking at countries of the so-called global south. You're looking at two countries in the Latin American region, and that's it. Why do you have to put an income or a wealth or a status to those two countries? They are two countries that exist independently. So I think the idea of taking it further and saying, well, these two countries belong to the global north or the global south, I think is redundant. And if you want to look at issues of, for instance, how do they compare to, say, two countries in Europe, you can simply do that. How do they compare to France and Spain? What was the Spanish colonial influence on these countries? I don't think we need to go into further details of classifying them according to their income, according to their wealth, according to their history, according to their geography. For me, it's as simple as that. I don't know if that answers your question, but it can be very simple if we wanted it to be.
Oh, yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Henry, do you have a question, or we have more questions here in the chat? Themrise, you can read one in English and I will translate the other. Octavio is asking, what are the parameters to define the cutoff points in dollars? I think that Octavio is talking about Roslin classification, maybe, because I have seen there the dollars cutoff points, the dollar levels. What are the parameters to define the cutoff points, Themrise?
I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question because I'm not an economist, and that's one part of Rosling's work that I haven't studied, one of many. I personally think we need to come to a common currency where we don't look at everything in dollars to begin with. But unfortunately, I will not be able to answer that question, Octavio. My apologies.
As I remember from Rosling's book, I think that is explaining in the Rosling's book, it's in the references of the paper. Let me see which was that. Okay, it's there, but there is a Rosling's book on global development. As I remember, he explained that very well in his book. I will look for here the name of the
reference will be there for the Rosling's entire paper, but we only limited our inquiry into the classification of countries based on income.
Yeah, and as I remember, he's explaining that in his book. But the Roslin book is Factfulness. Is the reference number 19? Okay. And Carlos is asking, what is the impact of this classification in health systems in Latin America? If the classification has any kind of impact on health systems of Latin America.
I think you're much better placed based on your experiences of Latin America to answer that. Has there been a negative impact? Globally, we see a negative impact in global health in all countries of the so-called global south, because we see an unequal distribution of resources. So we see an unequal distribution of, for instance, health resources from the rich countries filtering down into countries of the global south. So that includes medical technology, that includes vaccines, that includes medical personnel, that includes medical infrastructure in these countries. Pakistan, for instance, I'll just give you an example. Our medical infrastructure is completely a private sector. Our public sector health doesn't exist anymore because the government has not invested in it. So we have very, very poor public health infrastructure in our country. And this classification has affected us to the extent that global aid says that, okay, we will provide, X country will provide Pakistan with this much aid to improve your public health infrastructure, or to provide better technology, or to give production of medications and vaccines. But it will make that decision based on other countries that have similar issues. And so we lose out on resources that could be equally distributed in each country. Within Latin America, again, I can't speak for you, but there are differences in resources. Public sector health systems are different in different countries. So you're talking about, again, different countries rather than just one region. Some countries may have access to better health resources than other countries, and that's probably because they are richer than other countries, or they have better governance systems and better political systems that invest in public health infrastructure. So the classification does affect in terms of the global aid in health that goes from the richer countries to poorer countries. Access in the sense that there are many countries classified as so-called global south, and so the so-called global north says we don't have enough money to cover the rest of the countries, whereas they do. So there is an imbalance and inequity in the distribution of health resources, I think, to countries in the so-called global south, and that is because the classification is very problematic.
Okay, thank you. And here we have another question from Henry. He's asking if are there social contexts that could produce or facilitate mental health problems in countries in the population, or violence and hopelessness are adaptations, social adaptations instead to be mental health problems? What do you think?
Again, I'm not a doctor or a global health person, so I won't be able to give a complete answer to that. But definitely, I mean, mental health is a very, very important part of global health anywhere in the world, not just in rich white countries, but any country you go to. And I think that is growing more and more. And the inequity is growing more and more in our country. So I know, for instance, in Pakistan, there is a very, very, very high level of mental health need for mental health, but we only have 500 doctors, psychiatrists, and psychologists in the entire country. Just 500 for a population of 220 million. And again, there is no investment. Culturally, it's because mental health is still a subject that is not accepted in our society. There is no such thing as mental health. But we all know that particularly after COVID, has become a very, very important health need, a global health need. So again, it comes into that countries of conflict, countries of war, for instance, you'll see Afghanistan, now you'll see Sudan, you see Yemen, you see so many countries at conflict and rising not just health needs, but mental health needs that are not being met. And mental health, interestingly enough, is not part of the global health package. So if you talk about organizations or countries that support global health, it's all about medication. It's all about trauma. It's all about illnesses that have vaccines to help them. Nobody really invests and talks about mental health counseling and psychiatry and psychology. And that is a very, very big, I think, gap in the global health system. And we need to now focus on mental health as much as we focus on any other illness around the world.
Okay, thank you. ¿Hay más preguntas? Do we have more questions? Okay, and I will ask to Themrise for take a picture of all of us. And now in Spanish. Vamos a tomar una foto, entonces por favor para que abran las cámaras y así queda las cámaras de todos en el mosaico, pues para los que quieran, y entonces tomamos una foto de la reunión. Laura de extensión se encarga de eso. A ver, solo está Octavio en cámara. Luz Adriana, por favor. Laura, ¿me avisas cuando ya esté la foto? Karen, ¿ya está la foto? ¿Sí?
Listo.
Sí, le
Ah,
sale
profe,
rápido.
dame un momento que están abriendo más cámaras, entonces voy a hacer otra.
Listo, gracias. Another picture, please. Thanks.
Listo, ya quedó.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for Themrise Khan to be here with us. It was an honor to have you here, and you are welcome again to another talk if you like. And now you know that there is a university here in Latin America, in Colombia, working on also on global health issues. And thank you very much for your participation.
Gracias. Thank you very much. I very, very much appreciate the invitation. And I'm sorry if I wasn't able to answer everybody's questions. That's why we had a group of 4 of us who contributed our individual expertise into the piece. But thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, hola. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Gracias
nice
a todos
day.
por su
Bye, bye.
participación. Nos vemos. Buen día.
Hasta luego.
Buen día.
Bye bye.
Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.